So we've been talking a lot about theories of economic development, but now we're going to circle back to that initial debate, that initial discussion we had about theories of international political economy and the debate between economic nationalists and economic liberals. And one of the core pieces of that debate was how they viewed competition, right? Economic nationalists viewed competition as something in which there were going to be winners and losers, and economic liberals tended to view competition as something that was positive sum. We all were better off. We all benefited from the idea of competition. And it's more than just competition keeps businesses on their toes and forces them to innovate and helps them find greater prices. When we talk about the advantages that come from competition, we need to talk about this idea of comparative advantage. This is a concept that was developed by the economist David Ricardo back in the 1700s, in which he argues that the goal of economics is to help actors find the economic decisions, the way that they can set up their economies and choose their behavior that minimizes opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is this idea that when you make a choice, you're missing out on other opportunities, and ideally we want to minimize the lost opportunities. And so we're going to talk about this in terms of David Ricardo sort of thinking about how this affects trade, but we're also going to talk about it just briefly in a way that I find useful in thinking about Brian Urlacher, the football player, and me, Brian Urlacher, the professor at the University of North Dakota, and what we should be doing with our summers. And so Brian Urlacher, the football player, he's now retired, but he has a big lawn, and he has to make a choice. Does he mow his own lawn during the summer, or does he hire me, Brian Urlacher, the faculty member at the University of North Dakota, who largely has his summer off, to mow his lawn for him? And we can think about this in two ways. We can think about this in terms of absolute advantage or comparative advantage. In terms of absolute advantage, we would ask, who is better at mowing the lawn? And the answer would clearly be Brian Urlacher, the football player, right? He was a defensive lineman, and so he's big and he's strong, and I imagine that the skill of pushing a lawnmower is very similar to the skill of pushing over an offensive lineman. He's in fairly good shape. I am not. I would probably have to stop regularly and get lemonade, whereas he could probably mow his lawn much faster. And so just in terms of who is better at it, he should be doing his lawn mowing because he's better at it. But Ricardo says that's the wrong way to think about these kind of decisions. Instead, what we should think about is the opportunity cost. And so the question that Brian Urlacher, the football player, should ask, and myself as well, is if he wasn't mowing the lawn, what would he be doing? And the answer is he'd be doing a lot of things. He'd be making chunky soup commercials, or he'd be visiting children's hospitals to bring joy to Chicago Bears football fan children, or doing commercials for hair growth formulas. I don't know what he does with his time, but all of those things would be things that would be good and valuable and a great use of Brian Urlacher, the football player's time. Whereas me, if I don't mow his lawn, my alternatives are to, I guess, mow my own lawn or write papers that maybe nobody will ever read. It's hard for me to make a case that I'm going to be using my time effectively doing something that generates value, whereas Brian Urlacher, the football player, can clearly make a case that if he can free himself up from mowing his lawn, he can do things of greater value. And so from the theory of comparative advantage and the idea that we're minimizing our opportunity costs, Brian Urlacher, the football player, should hire me to mow his lawn so that he can do important stuff. And the idea of comparative advantage is that if we do that, if we structure our economy in that way, that we're going to end up producing more stuff overall, and there'll be more stuff to go around. And this is sort of the foundation of economic liberal theory's idea that trade and competition is positive sum. Okay, so let's talk about this in a little bit more concrete economic terms. I'm going to walk you through an example that was used by David Ricardo to illustrate his argument about comparative advantage. And so Ricardo is talking about a fictitious world in which there are two countries, Portugal and England, and there are essentially two goods that they can produce. They can produce wine and they can produce cloth. And if you look at what it takes to produce $100 worth of each of those goods, Portugal is clearly better in absolute terms. If they want to produce $100 of wine, they need 8 people working on wine production to produce that much wine. Whereas England needs 11. They need 3 more people to produce a comparable amount of wine. When it comes to producing cloth, Portugal is better than England as well. It takes 9 people to produce $100 worth of cloth versus 10 people in England to produce that same $100 worth of cloth. So Portugal is more efficient in terms of producing stuff than England is. And if there's no trade, and Portugal and England are both supposed to use their populations, which I guess for the sake of math, we're going to set it 10 people each, and they both use their populations to produce stuff, and they produce half their people are working on wine, and half their people are working on cloth, then Portugal's going to crank out $62.50 in wine and $55.50 in cloth, and they're going to have $118 worth of stuff because they've got 10 people working on these two goods. England's going to come in a little bit under that. They're going to produce $95.40 worth of stuff because it takes a lot of English people to produce wine. They're only going to get $45.40 worth of it, and you're only going to get about $50 worth of cloth because they've got 5 people working on cloth. And so collectively, the two countries are going to produce $213.40 worth of stuff. Right? Okay, so that's what would happen if there wasn't trade. Ricardo says, well, what would happen if instead of structuring it where each country is trying to produce everything on their own, Portugal looks at this and says, well, we're better at producing cloth than England, but we're a lot better at producing wine. Maybe we should be producing all the wine, and we'll let Britain produce all the cloth or England produce all the cloth. And if that's what happens, that each country takes their 10 people and puts them to work specifically on wine production in Portugal, cloth production in England, then the end result is that Portugal's going to be producing $125 worth of wine, and England's going to be producing $100 worth of cloth, again, because each country has 10 people working on these industries. And rather than $213, they're now producing $225 worth of stuff, which means there's more stuff going to each country, and both Portugal can benefit from this and England can benefit from this, and roughly there's 5.6 more stuff being produced, both wine and cloth, because the countries are able to trade. And again, it's not that one country was good at producing wine and one country was good at producing cloth. Portugal was better at both of those. But even though Portugal was better at both of those, because it was so much better at producing wine, it made sense for Portugal to produce wine. Just like Brian Urlacher, the football player, is better at mowing his lawn than I am, he's able to do things that I'm not able to do, like make chunky soup commercials. And therefore, given that making chunky soup commercials is something that pays a lot or contributes a lot to GDP, I guess, he should be doing that. He shouldn't be mowing his lawn. Even if I do it worse, that's still a better overall outcome for both him and I in terms of how we use our time. So the idea of comparative advantage is that you find not only the way that you can, contribute effectively to the global economy, but you look around and you find what everybody else is producing and what they're good at and what they're not good at, and you find the contribution that you can make that's going to free up resources so that everybody can produce collectively the maximum amount of stuff. And that's the foundation of this idea that trade and competition pushes us toward our comparative advantage and thus produces more goods and services for us to consume because of trade, as opposed to trying to do everything on our own.